السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين. أفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا حبيبنا شفيعنا قرة أعيننا محمد عبده ورسوله صلى الله عليه وآله وصحبه ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. أما بعد. وتعرف, honourable guests, scholars, thank you for coming. This is a rather it can be a very emotional topic. I mean, this is an area which they call POE, problem of evil. I'll be looking at a sub-area, the problem of animal suffering. Believe it or not, our ulama dealt with this problem. I say dealt with it, but they addressed it early on. The Mu'tazila had their account of what happens to animals. Even before the Mu'tazila, Imam al-Ash'ari in his maqalat, he notes down several accounts that scholars had given, mutakallimun had given, as to what happens to animals when they pass away after their earthly existence. Some of them, Allah gives a beautiful form and puts them in Jannah, and they live forever and ever in Jannah. Some of them turn to dust, which seems to be the sort of the mutakallimun position after the 3rd century. Some of them go on to live other lives, and there's a whole taxonomy of views. I can't go through them. There's a lot I want to say, but I can't because of the time constraints. But let me mention what I will cover. In my paper, what I do address is I build, first of all, the status of animals within the Islamic tradition. And there's been a paradigm shift in how to look at animals within the Islamic tradition based on developments in animal mind, animal cognition, animal consciousness. I try to bring that into my thesis, into my chapter, but I can't read it today. But the structure that I give is that there's 3 theses that I claim within the Islamic tradition. The welfare thesis regarding animals, how we look after animals and their well-being. The similarity thesis, what they call, based on the Quran, umun amthalukum. Allah talks about how they are like nations like you. And ulama very interestingly discussed how animals resemble human beings and in what respect. Very, very surprisingly, we would find the ulama of tasawwuf, like Imam al-Sha'rani and his ustad, like Imam al-Khawas, they believe animals have ruh. They have ruh. I mean, they are fully fledged conscious beings. I don't have time to go into that. That's something maybe we can pick up on later on. And the 3rd thesis I call is the psychology thesis. The Quran and the Hadith, they indicate a high view of animals, a rich psychology of animals. Animals are given a voice in the Quran. The hudhud, we've got the ant, the namla, we've got they've got reasoning powers and things like that. So there's a rich psychology within the Quran and Hadith about animal mental cognition. I sketched that out in the chapter. I can't go through that, but let me lay out what the problems is supposed to be. If here is the argument, just up there on the screen if you can read it. This is an evidential argument for the problem of evil. Now Sheikh Sa'id yesterday mentioned that one of the challenges that Muslims are facing, or any believer is facing, is the mas'ala to shar, is the problem of evil. Now in anyone who's familiar with the academic literature will know that there are generally 2 types of problem of evil arguments: the logical problem and then the evidential problem. The logical problem is supposed to argue that the idea of evil and God logically contradict each other. In the literature, that's no longer the case. It's been put to rest, tucked in its bed, and it's having its deep slumber. But what is lingering, what is carrying on, is what they call the evidential argument for the problem of evil. And that makes the claim that, okay, you believe in God, you believe in the core attributes of God. He's just, He's wise, He's benevolent, He's omniscient, He's omnipotent. But given all the suffering in the world, in this case animal suffering, and the seemingly pointless suffering, doesn't that make it unlikely for such a being to exist? Or isn't there some kind of sort of inconsistency in the deity that you believe in? So the evidentiary argument it tries to show that it's improbable that the God that you believe in is a coherent God. It's an incoherent God. It may exist, but the type of being you believe in is incoherent, it's inconsistent. So that's called the evidential argument. It's improbable that the kind of God you believe doesn't exist. So here's the argument. One formulation, my formulation of it. there is profusion of animal suffering and pain in the world, which an omniscient, benevolent, just and wise being could have prevented without thereby losing some greater good or permitting some evil equally bad or worse. An omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent, just and wise being would prevent occurrence of the profuse animal suffering unless it could not do so without thereby losing some greater good or permitting some evil equally bad or worse. Therefore, there does not exist an omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent, just and wise being. To simplify that argument, this is how I put it. If the God of the Quran exists, then there is no pointless pain and suffering of animals in the world. But there are cases of pointless animal pain and suffering that we observe in the world. Therefore, the God of the Quran most likely doesn't exist. Now, this kind of argument requires an inference. It's not quite clear what the argument is saying, so it relies on an inference. And I put it up there from O, which is observation, and C, which is conclusion. The observation is that apparently we see or we observe evil that is just pointless. There seems to be no purpose to it. Therefore, we conclude, the inference, that there isn't any. So we observe that there doesn't seem to be or appear to be any point towards the evil. Therefore, we make the inference, the conclusion that there isn't any. So that's the inferential step. And that's quite important as to how I'm going to come to talk about how the Maturidi and the Ash'ari actually deal with this problem. Okay, so that's a simpler version. So the second premise is the one that our ulama from our tradition really address, premise 2. Right, but before we go into that, it's very important that I outline, and we do understand that this whole argument rests on presuppositions, i.e. ideas that are already believed in or taken, but not argued for, and I've listed them as 8, and I've called them the value thesis. So God ought to prevent the evil of animal harm, pain and suffering, so he ought to do that. God ought only to desire the happiness and pleasure of all creatures, including animals. God ought to recompense any animal pain and suffering. T3, by the way, is the doctrine of the Mu'tazila, the doctrine of Iwal. They say if Allah harms an animal, Allah's got to compensate it. So T3 is the Mu'tazila doctrine of Iwal. T4, God ought not to use evils as a means. So Allah shouldn't use the harming of creatures for a greater good. He shouldn't do that. Yeah. Supposition number 5, God ought never to allow pointless evils. Okay? God ought to justly balance evil and harm of animals with an equal or greater good. God ought to have justifying reasons for permitting the evil of animal pain and suffering. So Allah should have some reason why he allows something to suffer. That's the presupposition. Finally, the final presupposition that guides these arguments, God ought to reveal his reasons for justifying and permitting the evil of animal pain and suffering. So if Allah causes pain to a creature, Allah should tell us why he does that. So these are all presuppositions that guide the whole discussion. And unfortunately, in a lot of the times when we look at the literature, this stuff is not untangled. Okay, so what we're going to see is the Mu'tazila and the Ash'ari and the Maturidiyya hit number 5, they hit number 4, they hit number 3, they hit number 2, they're hitting all of them. Yeah, so I'm going to give you some examples, hopefully, just to sort of elucidate what's going on. Okay, here's a typology of possible ways of explaining evil. And I've used Harrison's typology, and there are ways to explain why evil exists, and in order to defend Allah's justice. That's called a theodicy. Now, whether theodicy is a term that was relevant for the mutakallimun, that could be debated. Let's assume for now that theodicy is a term that's not contested, that's relevant, and that ulama engaged in theodicy. So here are some of the theodicies, and the ones that I'm going to highlight are 6 and 9 from the Maturidi tradition. All of them pretty much we can find in the, apart from number 1 obviously, but all of them we can find within the Kalam tradition, in the Maturidi tradition as well, and I developed that in my paper. So I'm going to be looking at animal suffering is a result of supernatural forces like Iblis. And number 9, animals actually don't suffer. They don't suffer. They may feel pain, but they don't suffer. And if they don't suffer, then they're not morally then there's no moral consideration here. But I address that in section 1 of my chapter, but I'll read sections of it. I'll read sections of it as we go. Okay, so what do the Maturidiyya say? What do the Maturidiyya say? Okay, I think it's important to understand some of the discussions were happening while al-Maturidi was formulating his views. And most of his views I get from the Ta'wilat Ahl Sunnah. Most of his theodicy I find in his tafsir. So it's very, very important, I think, that we need to read it. I think the latest edition is 9 or 8 volumes. And there's a lot of his theology embedded in his tafsir. And some of that I hope to bring out just to show you with some examples. But let me just read one of the responses that I won't address today, but I need you to read it because it's very, very important. It's not a theodicy. It doesn't explain why evil happens or to defend Allah's justice, but it's a kind of epistemological turning, posturing. And this is known as skeptical theism. My view is, could be debated, my view is that the Ash'ari view is not a theodicy, it's skeptical theism. And skeptical theism just says, all this evil that's happening in the world that we see, we can't say for sure if it's pointless or not. We do not have the ability to know whether they're pointless or not, given the kind of being God is. And if that's the case, then we need to have epistemic humility and say God knows in his best interest why he's allowed it to happen. That's called skeptical theism. We find that in the Maturidi thought as well. But I'm claiming they go one step further. I'm claiming the Maturidiyya go one step further. And their view is what we call mystery theodicy. And I'll mention the quote in just a second, because I'm going to be using Ibn al-Humam as well, who hasn't been quoted, quite surprisingly, so far. But I think is very, very key, especially in Maturidi theology as well. Because he was, but anyway, I haven't got time to go through why Ibn al-Humam is so important. But let me read what the Ash'ari response is on skeptical theism, because pretty much that is the same argument rehearsed by the Maturidiyya. And in fact, Ibn al-Humam rehearses that same argument. So after the Mu'tazila say, why do animals suffer? The Mu'tazila say, you know what, don't worry. What's going to happen is, Allah's going to compensate that animal. That's where the doctrine of Iwad comes in. Allah's going to compensate the animal for the harm that was given to that animal. Whether by Allah's permission, or by some other creature. Allah is going to give it a better repayment, a better compensation. So the Ash'ari respond, and they say, hang on a second, that can't be right. And so what the Ash'ari are doing, they're attacking number 4, number 5, number 6, number 7, and they're attacking 1, 2, 3 as well. So what do the Ash'ari say? The Ash'ari account, on the other hand, is clear. One set of their arguments attacks T1, T2, and T3, T4, T5, and T6, and T7. Hence, the Ash'ari stance is aggressively sweeping its scope. In the case of the first set of arguments, both Al-Ghazali and Al-Razi, in their formulation of animal pain and suffering, reject all Mu'tazilite claims that God is under any obligation to recompense his creatures. The standard Ash'ari line, which is also the Maturidi line, is that the response of these claims include demonstrating first how it is a category mistake to apply the definitions of obligation, wujub, and injustice, dhulm, to Allah. If by obligation it is meant meriting censure for the omission of an act or duty, and by injustice if it is meant infringing on the rights of another's property, then these are inapplicable to Allah, just like it is inapplicable and nonsensical to say a wall is ignorant or a wall is frivolous, the wind is frivolous. God cannot be under any moral obligation to compensate animals simply because he is not beholden to a moral decree or a command, nor is he in debt to any created being. God is also cannot be judged as unjust because creation is his dominion and his property, and thus no violation of property rights occurs. Imam Maturidi makes the same argument. He says that if I buy something and I own it and I break it, I've not done any act of injustice. But if I take someone else's object and I break it, that's injustice. I've infringed on the rights of others, and he mentions that in his Ta'wilat. I've got all the quotes here in the essay, but I haven't got time to read them. So God can also, animals owe their existence to the contingent act of God's benevolence. Secondly, failing to compensate animal harm and suffering to animals would not entail God acting contrary to his wisdom, if by wisdom is meant knowledge of the order of things and the power to materialize that order. نظام الأمور والقدرة على ترتيبها. There is nothing inherently contradictory, the Ash'arites claim, and the Maturidiyya as well, between God not compensating animals for their pain and suffering and this definition of wisdom. In other words, it does not logically follow that God is not wise if he does not compensate animals. Finally, the doctrine of compensation, iwad, would create moral quandaries. If an animal will be compensated for a far greater good, for some evil it suffers, then it will be morally praiseworthy to cause that animal harm in order for that animal to secure that greater benefit that awaits it. But this is paradoxical. This goes contrary to our moral intuition. So some of the Ash'ari arguments, like Imam al-Razi says that if the iwad is something better that Allah gives for an animal, then it must make rational sense to cause the animal pain so we can get that higher compensation. Although arguably this is a caricature, the Ash'ari counter-argument is intended to highlight the logical entailment of a view that places the locus of ethical obligations solely on the outcomes. Now the Mu'tazila were consequentialists in the ethics. They didn't subscribe to a voluntarism like the Ash'ari did. They looked at the outcomes of actions. If something causes a harm, then that is something that God ought not to do. Yeah. So in the case of animal suffering, because it causes them harm, God is obliged to compensate for that harm. So it's a very utilitarian, consequentialist view. Now obviously the Ash'ari and the Maturidiyya don't believe that Allah is an act utilitarian being. They don't believe that Allah is a pleasure maximizer. That's not Allah's remit, being the creator of the universe. It's not his job to say, right, I'm going to max you up to grade 10 level pleasure. I'm going to max you up to 8. So he's not a pleasure maximizer. So the Maturidiyya and the Ash'ari both reject the doctrine of aslah, and they reject the doctrine that Allah is obligated to do what is in the material interest of his creatures. Okay, so that's skeptical theism. That's my take on the Ash'ari and the Maturidiyya trying to epistemologically make a turn away from the evidential problem of evil. They're saying that we don't know. Allah, for all we know, he can allow suffering. We just don't know if they're pointless or not because we are cognitively finite beings and we're dealing with the mind of an omniscient being. Alright, so very quickly, what is the Maturidi argument? I know I'm running out of time, so I may just jump to the mystery theodicy and sort of conclude there. The Maturidiyya, I am arguing the core Maturidiyya defense of why evil exists is a mystery. Now whether it can be called a theodicy or not, I'll leave that for now. But I would argue that it's a mystery theodicy and it cannot be clearer. So what's the gist of the argument? So Ibn al-Humam says, and I'll give you the Arabic quote in just a second, we just don't know how certain evils or the profusion of evil, the fact that there's so much evil in the world, the mere quantity of evil, the mere repetition and occurrence of evil brings about a greater good or serves some wise purpose. We just don't know how that happens. But God, being the kind of being that he is, wise, just, benevolent, omnipotent, omniscient, acts with wisdom. We have to submit to the states of affairs as they are and work towards implementing his commands to justly steward the environment. Ultimately, God's wisdom is inscrutable. Imam al-Maturidi is very, very clear on that. Ultimately, we don't know what Allah does in terms of his hikmah. It's beyond our comprehension how his wisdom plays out. And it's interesting why he has to make that argument, because the Ash'ari say Allah's will, his irada, is ultimately inscrutable. How Allah exercises his will, we don't know. Nothing drives Allah to do an action. There's no ba'ith for his actions. There's no gharad for his actions. This is the position of the Ash'ari. So why Allah does something, nothing pushes him to do it. He acts purely out of the sheer enactment of his will and the power to actualize his will. The Maturidiyya, because they take the focus away from the irada of Allah to the hikmah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they then have to say ultimately Allah's hikmah is inscrutable. And Imam al-Maturidi is very clear in his tafsir where he says we just don't know Allah's hikmah, ultimately how it plays out. This is why the Maturidiyya don't believe evil actually exists. There's proximate evil and then there's ultimate evil. So there is proximate evil in the sense that when I see something bad happen, I think it is bad and I judge it to be evil. And then they call that proximate evil through our perception and internalization of what's bad. But ultimately there is no evil because the thing that happened aligns with Allah's wise purpose. So So Allah's wise purpose finally plays out. It may not play out in my life or our lives, but it will play out in the unfolding of the providential organization of Allah of the entire human history. So, what is then this mystery theodicy? This is the quote that Ibn al-Humam brings. This is his discussion on the whole idea of Ilam al-Baha'im, and he comes to this conclusion. He says, the Mashayikh, قال مشايخ الحنفية خصومة البهيمة أشد من خصومة المسلم يوم القيامة كخصومة الذمي. Now obviously there's a hadith that the Prophet says, I'm going to be the one who fights to raise the case of the dhimmi yawm al-qiyamah. So if anyone hurts a dhimmi, someone who's got protection or citizenship under an Islamic political system, anyone's got citizenship under an Islamic system, he's a dhimmi, he or she's a dhimmi. Anyone who harms them by even saying a bad word, Rasulullah will be the one, the advocate on yawm al-qiyamah. And that's a serious issue. وقد لا ندرك كما في البهائم ونحوها فيحكم بحسنه قطعا ويعتقد فيه قطعا حكمة قصرنا دركها فيجب تسليم له واعتقاد الحقية في فعله ولا ترك اعتراض له الحكم والأمر لا يسأل عما يفعل بحكم ربوبيته وكمال علمه وحكمته الباهرة التي قد يقصر عن دركها عقول الكل والله يعلم وأنتم لا تعلمون وهم يسأل عن حكم العبودية ومملوكية. That's his conclusion. After giving an analytical discussion in Al-Musayara, he comes to this conclusion that, you know what, Allah in His hikmah knows why He allows all these animals to suffer. We just don't know why. But what we do know is the kind of being that Allah is, that He's informed us about. So all we can do is just submit to His unfathomable wisdom. Submit to His unfathomable wisdom and work on implementing the commandments that Allah has given. That I take to be a mystery theodicy. Evil at the end of the day is inexplicable why it happens. But because of Allah's hikmah, He will, in the end, He will allow the good to prevail, even though at this moment in time we see it as evil. So evil is perspectival on the Maturidi position. It's proximate, but it's never ultimate. Because there can never be ultimate evil, because Allah's hikmah trumps everything at the end. Whereas on the Asha'ira, Allah's irada trumps everything at the end. So this was a quote that Imam al-Maturidi talks about, that the hikmah of Allah is ultimately inscrutable. So وَأَصْلُهُ أَنَّ اللَّهَ عَزَّ وَجَلَّ جَائِزٌ أن ينشئ الأشياء فيها حكمة وسرية لا يبلغها علم الخلق ولا يدركها حكمة البشر على ما جعل النعم الظاهرة فيها حكمة معنى لا يبلغ علم الخلق ولا حكمة البشر وكذلك البلايا والشدائد فيها حكمة لا يبلغ علم الخلق فعلى ذلك جائز أن خلق إبليس وعصاة الخلق لحكمة جعل في ذلك حكمة لا يبلغ علم الخلق ولا يدرك حكمة البشر على ما ذكرنا. So again, he's saying this hikmah of Allah is inscrutable, simply because Allah is the kind of being that He is. But obviously for Maturidi, and this was the point that Dr. Tabanu mentioned yesterday about pastoral theology, Imam al-Maturidi believes in a kind of educational theodicy. Now what that means is that for him this is Darul Bala. This is the world where we're going to be tested. But the tests are supposed to augment us as moral beings. So the difficulties that we go through, the shada'id and the ibtila that we go through, it's supposed to be the furnace that makes us into morally suitable beings to come in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on Yawm al-Qiyamah. So for him, he believes this is the wisdom why Allah puts these, what we perceive to be evils in the world. Ultimately, it's to make us morally better beings. But the question then becomes what do we do then now? Do we do more of theology? Do we do more of Kalam to solve this problem? I would say the Maturidiyya they don't argue that. What they're arguing for is how do we become better moral beings now in the kind of world that we live in, with the kind of evil and suffering that we see, whether to animals or human beings. Because doing more theology doesn't solve that. What we need more of is how to make meaning, construct meaning out of suffering. And that's different. That's a whole different approach now. That's not theodicy. That's going into pastoral care. That's going into how do I construct cognitive, how do I format my cognition so it aligns with something that makes my being meaningful. That is a whole different topic. So I'll end it there. I know I didn't go through the argument for why Iblis is responsible for the pain of animal suffering and the fact that animals don't feel pain. But there are two long sections, and I bring in the literature from science, from animal psychology, animal cognition, neuroscience, to sort of try and show that a lot of philosophers are reviving the idea that animals don't suffer. They may have nociception, they may respond to physical stimuli, but what they don't do is they don't suffer in the way that human beings suffer. Suffering it requires higher order, sort of a higher order thinking, what they call HOT. Animals apparently don't have that. They don't have high order cognition. They don't have what was mentioned yesterday, I think, second order thinking, second order desires. Harry Frankfurt's quote, I think, Professor Nazif, you mentioned that yesterday. Animals don't seem to have, they can't think about thinking. They don't have intentionality. They can't direct their thinking about things. Animals apparently don't seem to have self-identity. They can't construct selfhood. They can't construct a personality about themselves. Or when they let's say they walk past a mirror, they don't walk back and say, "You're looking dashing today." They have no recognition of their own selves in that way. If they don't have that, the scientific literature is starting to challenge that, and some Islamic thinkers are also challenging that based on the Quranic reassessment of the Quranic hikayat about the Sabiqa, like Sulaiman alayhi salam, and the Hudhud and the Namla and all that. Are these exceptions that Allah mentions, or are these actually, is Allah telling us something about animals and animal consciousness? So there's an area to be explored there. But those who don't agree that animals have higher order consciousness, higher order thinking, then in effect animals don't suffer. So what we see animals going through, they actually don't suffer, but they may have pain. But the pain threshold is very low. But they don't suffer in a morally significant way the way human beings do. But in either case, even if animals don't suffer, animal advocates, those who espouse animal ethics, animal rights philosophers and thinkers, they're still not convinced by these theodicies, these maneuvers made by theologians to respond to that, to explain animal pain and suffering. But that is inevitable because we're explaining it from a supernatural worldview. We're explaining it from a worldview that assumes that there is a deity, who's omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent, he's just, wise, and so we assume that that kind of being already exists. So within a supernatural worldview, it may make sense, but in a non-supernatural worldview, in a naturalistic worldview, obviously these theodicies won't make a lot of sense, and they won't be meaningful, and they won't go any way, I suppose, in helping towards coming to some common ground and these kind of things. So I know I rushed through it. I know there's a lot to say on it, but I tried to cram it in the time that we have. So I do appreciate your patience and giving me the time to give the presentation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chowdhury, for a very enlightening lecture. We'll have some time for some input, and I see it's some very eager questions already. You can give the mic to Dr. Tobanur.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much for the presentation, Safaruk. I would like to ask you some questions. It might go a little bit beyond the animal suffering itself, but I still want to ask them just in case. One of the questions I have actually is, the whole concept of when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decided to create a human being, and the angels said, why would you do that? Create human beings that are going to make a zulm on earth. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's response is, I know what you know not. So in that response, there must be some value to human beings that makes Allah nevertheless decide to create human beings, although he knows that they will make zulm on earth. And that kind of value, whatever that is, you know, must have been higher in, you know, must have been higher than the fact that he's going to make zulm. Therefore, God has decided to create human beings anyway. So is there anything that you've come across in terms of, you know, what that value, what is so valuable about human beings that God has nevertheless decided to, or is that also a mystery in your thought? I've got a few,
sure,
so I will just ask them quickly. And the other one is, at the very last part of your presentation, you have come to the concept of past manavi care, if you want to say so. And now, when you look at it from the mystery aspect, mystery theodicy aspect, now if, you know, and you want to actually do the pastoral, if you want to say so, the manavi care to the community, you know, on the grassroots level. So, and so how do you approach the whole thing then, if it's all a mystery, and then, you know, you know, and people come who have actually suffered, or whose animal has suffered, or whatever, you know, and they have that sort of, you know, they go through that pain, you know. So, do you tell them it's all a mystery? Sorry, you know, how do you respond to that? Yeah, and then the other thing is, again, have you come across any writings on the concept of human faculties, and by that I mean, because again you mentioned Maturidi's view that human beings live on this earth and they will go through all sorts of inflicts and calamities, but it will make them, you know, stronger, if you want to say so, in their lives. So we ought to have that sort of, you know, inflictions to raise our ranks, if you want to say so. But then there is lots of faculties in human beings, latifa, that are hidden, that we don't even know about, that we have them. We only know them, they only appear if we actually go through certain things. Like, for example, as long as my mother hasn't died, I won't know what kind of feeling that is unless I have gone through it, lived it. And then that hidden latifa that I had until I was, you know, 30 and I didn't know about it, all of a sudden will come to surface. And then I will know what it feels like. And we have, I believe, you know, thousands of that kind of latifa that we don't know about, that will come apparent through life, through the you know, calamities that we go through, basically, in our lives. So,
I mean, all right, so to take the first question first, when I looked at, when Allah talks about إِنِّي جَاعِلٌ فِي الْأَرْضِ خَلِيفَةً, when I looked at the tafsir on Maturidi on that, it's very different from someone like, say, Ibn Rushd. Ibn Rushd said, look, when Allah says, إِنِّي أَعْلَمُ مَا لَا تَعْلَمُونَ, I know what you do not know, Ibn Rushd's argument was, because it's very similar to the Mu'tazila, is that Allah has put a greater good, and he says this very clearly, there is a greater good in why Allah is going to allow the fasad and the corruption to happen, because He's got in store the greater good. And the greater good, it seems to be, is human freedom, the free will. Because by free will, human beings choose to enter into a loving relationship with Allah. They seem to be Allah's servants through choice. And that is too much of a greater good not to give up. And therefore Allah, at the cost of fasad and corruption, is willing to allow that to happen, to trade it for human free will. That could be the greater good in Ibn Rushd's argument. You know, it's one possible reading, but there is a greater good. Maturidi doesn't go down that route. He just said this fasad, this corruption, is there to test you. It goes back to his educational theodicy. It's all about soul building. Forget whether, you know, some greater good or not. Of course there's a greater good because Allah is all wise. But that's not for us. For us is Allah wants to put us through the furnace to make us better people. Now, what cognitive powers we're going to need, or what faculties we're going to have to draw on in order to be able to withstand these trials and tribulations, I'm yet to find it in a way where Al-Maturidi has packaged it in his tafsir, because it's scattered everywhere. And it's a huge tafsir. I mean, I'm trying to peel through a lot of the areas where these kind of things are addressed. But as of yet, I've not found it where he's put it in a packaged way. He just talks about the qualities that you need to have, like patience, to be resilient, to ask Allah for tawfiq, that kind of grace, divine grace, things like that. But whether he's addressed it, I need to put that all in a sort of in one place and sort of systematic analyze it to see how consistent they are. So I haven't done that yet. But on your point about what do we do now then? Do we just say to someone, this evil is a mystery? Well, this is one of our challenges now. We have to, in terms of not just our youth, but a lot of people who may believe in Allah, they may believe in God, but they can't reconcile the scriptural data they have about their creator and the way the world is operating. They've got this dissonance. Now, how we tackle that dissonance, that might not be the work of theologians per se. That might not be the work of philosophers per se. That's got to be the work of people who have a deep knowledge of psychology, psychotherapy. So maybe here the combinations of these two things in some of the work that you're doing needs to be brought together, and then maybe we can have some studies ready for people to use. But other than that, the tradition is tasawwuf. It's the spiritual tradition of riyadatun nafs. Struggling to build the qualities required in order for someone to be a congruent worshipper of Allah. So building things like clearing up one's intentions, purifying one's thoughts, sort of inculcating patience in oneself, things like that. All the maqamat that the ulama of tasawwuf laid down, but how we can reframe that, retranslate that, that's a challenge, and I don't know at this moment in time, but it's something it looks like that we need to do, because if we just say now Allah's hikmah governs everything, we just don't know, and we leave it at that, that's almost like resignation almost. Well, these ulama weren't resigned ulama. Ibn al-Humam was no way a resigned alim, but they were active in the world to change the world. But how we translate that now, I don't know. Yeah, it's a tough.
Can we give the microphone to Dr. Mustafa? I'm sorry.
Tough one.
Jazakallah khairan. Brilliant presentation. Barakallah feek. On the question, do we do more theology? Yes, more theology might lead to a better, morality. The very presentation is a theological, basically. Discussion that basically helps people. I'm helped basically to become more conscientious about animals and animal rights today. I would advise against the use of the fairness imagery. All this Nazi language that So I would choose something. You can choose, but no fairness. The third point, it might sound, redundant or technical, but when you refer to a deity, and in one instance you said, the kind of being, referring to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the kind of being, and then you basically list, for example, being omniscient, basically omnipotent and benevolent, the kind of being. Does this language refer to a genus? I'm talking about the language. The kind of being. That might be problematic.
Yeah, I wouldn't, because in an academic paper, I guess it'll pass, but in our tradition, we wouldn't say this. In our tradition, we wouldn't use the language that gives an idea that there is a jins of a deity. We won't do that. We can't do that. This is what we learn in our Aqidah manuals straight away. Allah is not a thing, nor a genus, nor a...
We'll have time for one last question, or maybe let's take two. Then we'll shorten the coffee break down. Can we give the mic to Dr. Arij?
Ladies first.
First, I just wanted to say thank you for that presentation. I've actually never come across a topic like this, so I have a lot of thoughts in my mind. I hope I'm able to articulate them. These are some thoughts that perhaps you could expand on. So I have sort of come from the understanding that the main difference between animals and human beings is the concept of free will, and that the fact that the animals cannot choose their actions or don't have the ability to, therefore they're not really inclined to the moral choices they make or the suffering, which is a cause or consequence of the choices that humans make. So how do you sort of understand the concept of animals suffering if they don't have the free will, or maybe they do, I'm not sure. And the other question is that perhaps animals don't suffer, but they are a part of a greater system, our universe. So if any sort of harm happens to them, it's a harm to the whole society or the environment. So how do we deal with understanding their purpose? And then what is the purpose of animals, and how can we deal with that? And finally, just the practical aspects of it. I've been hearing many times when the whole Eid happens and there's the sacrifice of the animals, there's this concept of it's animal suffering. So how do we understand that within our traditions, or justify it, I guess, where is the purpose of the animal to be self-sacrificial, or what is the ultimate purpose? And yeah, I think that's it. I'll stop there.
I touch on this. Let me start with animal slaughtering first. I touch on this in the paper, because part of the paper is distilled from a larger chapter of hopefully a book that will be coming out soon. But you're not allowed. The general rule is you're not allowed to kill any animate creature, except for when God has given the permission to do it. In one case, is slaughtering. Now, obviously, for these slaughter, the Mu'tazila rationalist school, they said that the animals will be compensated for it. Yeah. So for the Ash'ari, this links to the idea of is there an overall purpose for an animal? Is there an animal teleology? It seems to be, from my reading of Maturidi and the Ash'ari, there's no greater purpose for animals. After resurrection, they're just going to be annihilated to dust, the doctrine of annihilationism. Whereas others believe that there's more than an eschatological recompense. They're going to have a post-mortem existence. Animals are going to have a post-mortem existence. They're going to be put in heaven, whether it's for an edifying purpose for the people in paradise, or whether it's for animals basking in the glory of paradise. These are all views we find early on in the scholastics. But from my reading, my limited reading of the Ash'ari and the Maturidiyya, there's no animal teleology. There's no greater purpose for them to serve. It seems to be the dominant view is that their service is they're created for instrumentality, i.e. for human consumption, use and benefit in the world. And then after that purpose has been served, that's it. It's annihilationism for them. It's dust. So in terms of animal slaughtering, because if you subscribe to divine command theory, God commands the permission as an exception to slaughter an animal, therefore it becomes something that's good by entailment of his command. If you're a Maturidi theologian, you'd say God in his wisdom has allowed a permission for animal consumption and animals to be slaughtered. So even though we may not know what that purpose is now, and it may seem ugly for us and evil, that idea of proximate evil, proximate harm, but in the end, there's a greater purpose to it. We don't know what it is. So that's some of the manoeuvring. The first point you made was animal consciousness and will they suffer. Like I said, I bring in the literature early on in the paper, and there seems to be a shift amongst philosophers that they're starting to claim that there is some kind of level, a rich cognition in animals. Now, the science, I have to say on this, I'm not an expert, but science the jury's out. The jury's out. But there has been a revival of what they call neo-Cartesianism. Now, that doctrine never gained ascendancy in any of the Islamic theological thought, that animals are just automata, they're robots. So if they're robots, you could do anything to them. We never had that view in the Islamic tradition. We believe that animals have pain and they suffer pain, but why God has allowed it to happen is one, either on his wisdom, he allows some greater good to come about, or that's the topic we're debating today. So it's a contested area of science whether animals have consciousness or not, but there's a growing literature towards it. There's a huge amount of literature. But there seems to be a revival of neo-Cartesianism amongst philosophers, that animals are just, they don't suffer in a morally significant way. And I was trying to show that the Maturidiyya, that kind of view can be extracted indirectly from the way they perceive animals. If they perceive animals as lower beings without consciousness, without phenomenal consciousness, they're not aware of their own states, then if animals suffer, if animals feel pain, they're not really suffering. So there's not really a problem of evil, as it were. And a lot of people don't like that. They don't like that. But I was just trying to show that the seeds of that in Islamic, you can make it out of a Kalam tradition. I don't know if in all that jumbled words there were some answers there, but we can discuss.
Okay.